There once premiered a Peter Malinauskas, who said free speech were for those who most shouted. But 'gainst a writer's revolt, he cried, "It's not my fault," and relied on advice quite dubious and doubted. A limerick for my viewers, and incidentally the reason why I did not receive an invitation to Adelaide Writers Week. However, I thought it prudent to lick my limericked lips, given we're about to enter a crow-eating cultural culinary context of literal, literary, textual tremors, tumblings, and rumblings over what has occurred in the past week. That is, of course, the controversy engulfing this year's Adelaide's Writers' Week, which has been in a full-blown mutiny mode over the Adelaide Festival Board's decision to cancel the scheduled appearance of Australian-Palestinian writer and academic Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah on somewhat vague and dubious grounds. A statement released by the board on the 8th of January 2026 last Thursday said, quote, "Whilst we do not suggest in any way that Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah or her writings have any connection with the tragedy of Bondi, given her past statements, we have formed the view that it would not be culturally sensitive to continue to program her at this unprecedented time so soon after Bondi," end quote. The statement did not specify which past statements it was referring to. Of course, there is no connection between Dr. Abdel Fattah and the very tragic Bondi shootings, other, of course, than the connection the Adelaide Festival Board has created. After the announcement of her cancellation, Dr. Abdel Fattah accused the board of, quote, "a blatant and shameless act of anti-Palestinian racism and censorship and a despicable attempt to associate me with the Bondi massacre," end quote. The apparent enthusiastic endorsement of cancel culture by the board has thus far resulted in, first of all, 110 of 124 writers withdrawing from the event, including former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, ABC reporter and 7:30 host Sarah Ferguson, who was due to interview Jacinda Ardern. The star British author Zadie Smith has also withdrawn, as has Pulitzer Prize-winning American Percival Everett, the Jewish-American journalist M. Gesson, former Greek finance minister, writer and international geopolitical commentator Yanis Varoufakis, high-profile journalist Peter Greste, multi-award-winning Australian authors Michelle de Cresta, Melissa Lukashenko, Helen Garner, Jane Caro, Peter Fitzsimmons, and on and on. And whilst not appearing this year at the Adelaide Writers' Week, or not scheduled to, the wonderful author Richard Flanagan publicly expressed support for those who have joined the boycott. Second of all, what this has caused is that now, as of this morning, the director of the Adelaide Writers' Week, Louise Adler, a Jewish child of Holocaust survivors and one of Australia's most influential literary figures, in the process of directing her fourth Adelaide Writers' Week, announced her resignation in an opinion piece published in The Guardian. Also, more than half of the Adelaide Festival Board have resigned, including the chair, Tracy Whiting AM, who was herself appointed by South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas in 2023, leaving only 3 board members and a government observer at the helm. Another notable incident arising is that 11 prominent cultural figures wrote to Premier Malinauskas and the board demanding the reinstatement of Dr. Abdel Fattah. The letter, written and drafted by Rob Brookman, who has held almost every major leadership role at the festival across 3 decades, including artistic director and executive director. That letter, co-signed by 11 co-signatories, including Neil Armfield, Joe Dyer, Jim Sharman, and Anthony Steele, all who have previously held senior artistic or administrative positions at the festival. That letter stated that the cancellation of Dr. Abdel Fattah's participation was a grave mistake which had brought the Adelaide Festival and Adelaide Writers' Week into disrepute, stating further, quote, "The festival board has previously been admirable in its support of the director's decisions in the face of vocal and well-organised opposition. The board's reversal of its principled support for the director and her program at this time is, in our view, antithetical to what the festival and Writers' Week have and should stand for. An about-face may be embarrassing, that is to re-invite Dr. Abdel Fattah, but it is both the right thing to do and will cauterise the growing damage to this much-loved and internationally significant South Australian cultural institution. To revoke Dr. Abdel Fattah's invitation inevitably and appallingly draws a direct link between her presence and the outrage of the Bondi massacre. Wickedness thrives in darkness and prejudice thrives in ignorance born of silence. The open discussion of ideas, beliefs, facts, and opinion is ultimately the pathway to community cohesion. Silencing and censorship are not, end quote. Also, in a post on Instagram last Saturday, former Greek finance minister, writer, and international geopolitical and economic commentator Yanis Varoufakis, while dramatically ripping up his invitation for the Adelaide Writers' Week, stated, quote, "The Zionist lobby has destroyed it by forcing the board to disinvite fellow author Randall Abdel Fattah, by identifying even Bob Carr, the former Premier of New South Wales and Australia's former Foreign Minister, an individual, quote, of concern, end quote, by forcing the director of Adelaide Writers' Week, my marvellous Jewish friend Louise Adler, to resign. They left me with no other option than to tear up my coveted invitation in public. As Louise says, friends and colleagues in the arts, beware of the future. They are coming for you." Now, yesterday, Federal Resources and Not Arts Minister Madeleine King curiously weighed in on the debate, somewhat unsolicited, telling the ABC she was surprised by Dr. Abdel Fattah's invitation to the event, and she should, quote, absolutely not be invited back, stating, quote, "I've seen the comments that the author in question made, and to be frank, in my own opinion, I'm surprised she ever got an invite to the Adelaide Writers Festival," end quote. Last Friday, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the wonderful MEAA, published a statement which read, quote, "Adelaide Writers' Week has long been a place for bold ideas and the freedom of expression. The festival board's suggestion that the mere presence of a Palestinian novelist who has expressed pro-Palestinian political views, quote, would not be culturally sensitive, end quote, in the wake of the Bondi tragedy betrays these principles. Excluding a worker based on their ethnic background and political opinions is unacceptable and undermines the festival's stated goal of fostering social cohesion. Linking Dr. Abdel Fattah to an act of terrorism to which she is in no way connected is deeply racist and offensive. By singling her out individually, it exposes her to abuse and vilification. This is a serious dereliction of duty on the part of the Adelaide Festival's board to uphold a duty of care for participants' health and safety at work. MEAA stands against racism, intolerance and censorship in the media, entertainment and arts industries," end quote. Now, importantly, the Adelaide Festival Board is governed by the Adelaide Festival Corporation Act 1998 of South Australia. Section 14, which provides that, quote, "no ministerial direction can be given as to the artistic nature or content of performances or other events or activities conducted or promoted by the corporation." Now, on Friday morning, the 9th of January, the day after the board's public cancellation statement, Premier Malinauskas told ABC Radio Adelaide that he, quote, wholeheartedly, end quote, supported the board's decision and that he had, quote, thought about this a lot, end quote, before informing the board of his position. On Friday, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Guardian reported that South Australian Premier doubled down on the decision to cancel Abdel Fattah, stating, quote, "by law, I as Premier am prevented from directing the board," correct. "I support the intent of this legislation and have made it clear at every juncture that I would not seek to direct the board. However, when asked for my opinion, I was happy to make it clear that the state government did not support the inclusion of Dr. Abdel Fattah on the Adelaide Writers' Week program." Now, the South Australian Minister for the Arts is Andrea Michaels, MP. So, it appears to boil down to whether Malinauskas offering his, quote, opinion constitutes a, quote, ministerial direction, which is prohibited under the Act, and that would depend on the context in which he or Ms. Michaels, as the authoritative minister, offered their so-called opinions. Now, it may be the case of doubling down on some very sweet, yes, ministerish type doublespeak, but we shall see. Another curious curial construction is that Section 8 of the Act provides that the board will consist of no more than 8 members appointed by the governor and the minister, and that the board must adhere to strict gender composition rules, where at least 2 members must be women and at least 2 members must be men. That seems to infer that the board must at least be constituted by 4 people. More on that in a second. So arguably, as there are only left 3 board members and a government observer, and 2 of the 3 board members are women, and the government observer is also a woman, but she's not a board member, is the Adelaide Festival Corporation or the relevant minister now in breach of the Act and the board not formally constituted? Well, Premier Malinauskas says no, and on Monday morning, he said in relation to the resignation of the 4 members, including the chair, quote, "The advice I received late last night is that it's still formally constituted and capable of making decisions. That will be assessed further today, and the department will be getting advice on that throughout the course of the day." My understanding is in the Act, there's a catch-all provision for these circumstances, and that the Act doesn't prescribe a minimum number of board members. The deficiency of 1 man doesn't mean the board is no longer formally constituted. That's the advice I've received, but that will be checked in throughout the course of the day. Well, the Act may not expressly prescribe a minimum number of board members, but there are various references, for example, in Section 12 of the Act, which governs the proceedings of the board, to, quote, "a majority of the members," end quote, of the board. Now, this would seem to infer that there would need to be at least 3 members of the board to be formally constituted, such that a majority of the board could be formed. However, given the mandatory requirement pursuant to Section 8, subsection 2 for gender parity of board members, which is a mandatory requirement, using the term must, it would seem that the board would only be formally constituted by having at least 4 members, 2 of whom are women and 2 men. As it stands, the board may not be formally constituted, and in that regard, may be unable to reach quorum, potentially paralysing its legal authority to make decisions for the 2026 event. And unfortunately, and perhaps ironically, if they did want to revoke the cancellation revoking Dr. Abdel Fattah's invitation, thereby re-inviting her to join the festival, they may not have the legal capacity nor the legal authority to do so. But alas, perhaps and presumably, the South Australian governor and minister and premier are likely in the throes of making urgent new appointments. Time will tell. Now, I also saw that in her letter of withdrawal from the festival, Stellar Prize winner Professor Claire Wright said she did so with a heavy heart and a gut full of outrage. She said, quote, "As a Jewish Australian, I'm shocked and insulted that the board could exploit the tragedy of Bondi to weaponise its much-loved and respected literary festival. As a writer, I stand shoulder to shoulder with Dr. Abdel Fattah and her democratic rights and entitlements to discuss her novel, titled Discipline, on any stage, in any city, in any country in the world." Notably, in 2023, there was similar controversy about a number of Palestinian writers on the bill of Adelaide Writers Week, including a Palestinian-American scientist, writer and activist, and Mohammed El-Kurd, a Palestinian poet whose debut collection, entitled Rifka, narrated his experience of dispossession in the Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood of East Jerusalem. In 2023, again, Louise Adler was the director. Again, she was still a Jewish child of Holocaust survivors, and she is still its current director. But in 2023, there was a lot of media build-up and criticism, the well-organised campaign to try and have these people cancelled, these Palestinian authors and poets, and Louise Adler stared down the media, reminding them that the authors were invited to speak at Adelaide Writers Week based on their books and not their social media comments, and that criticism of Israel was not the same as anti-Semitism. On the 2023 opening night, South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas admitted that he had been under immense pressure to axe the festival's funding, or the Writers' Week's funding. Could be the whole Adelaide Festival as well. That will need to be looked into, and that he had considered doing so, but he decided it would set a dangerous precedent if a government determined who was allowed to speak. Thank God Peter Malinauskas had attended his civics classes and learnt a bit about democracy. Not only that, it would also breach the law because, as previously mentioned, there is to be no ministerial direction under the Act regarding who is invited to speak and or perform, and who does indeed speak and or perform. Malinauskas also said at that time, quote, "If I was to unilaterally defund Writers' Week on the basis of Susan Abulawa's views, what path does that take us down? It's a path to a future where politicians decide what is culturally appropriate, a path, in fact, that leads us into the territory of Putin's Russia." End quote. Oh, how times have changed. As former federal Liberal Party Attorney General George Brandis stated at his Writers' Week event in 2023, quote, "This is the test of whether you believe in a civil and free society. That is whether you're prepared to respect the right of others to have views you find profoundly objectionable," end quote. Now, of course, when it comes to freedom of speech, it is trite, albeit powerful, to quote Evelyn Beatrice Hall in her biography of Voltaire in 1906. In summarising Voltaire's views on free speech, she wrote, and I quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," end quote. Too right, Vegemite. It is sad but necessary that we all need to revisit our fundamentals of democracy, or Democracy 101, or Democracy for Dummies textbooks at this dark time in history, both globally and in Australia. And it is particularly stark and remarkable that it appears to be Labor governments around this country who are enforcing significant clampdowns on freedom of speech, and who are endorsing and prescribing this culture of cancellation of speech. It is very concerning and very surprising. And of course, the libertarians on the other side and roundabouts should equally be as committed to freedom of speech as the members of the unions and the Labor Party. So when did cancel culture become so acceptable and mainstreamed in Australian society? And why is there no enshrined protection legally for freedom of speech and freedom of expression in our Constitution or in federal law? These are great questions worthy of further episodes in their own right, so stay tuned. Now, I can say on that issue, Australia remains alone among Western liberal democracies as being bereft of or without a Federal Human Rights Act or Federal Human Rights Charter. Of course, we don't have a Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Ironically, former Australian colonies, Papua New Guinea and Nauru, they had their constitutions drafted and they had Bills of Rights in their constitutions. But for some reason, successive Australian governments have decided that Australians don't deserve basic legal protections of fundamental, universally recognised basic human rights. I've done a lot of research into it, and a master's dissertation, and I still find it perplexing, even after running the 4-year or assisting with running the 4-year campaign for the Queensland Human Rights Act between 2015 and 2019, and we did succeed on that. But it was a lot of hard work, and a lot of that hard work was educating politicians about the value and importance and history and democratic necessity of legally protecting basic, universally recognised human rights. Indeed, it was surprising the level of ignorance, and it was surprising how much work we had to do to get it over the line. But I will comment more on that in future episodes. Now, in an op-ed published in The Guardian on the 12th of January, high-profile journalist Peter Greste echoed the Voltairean sentiments by stating, quote, "I do not need to agree with Abdel Fattah's views to believe that removing her in this way is wrong. The issue is not about ideological alignment. It is about principle and precedent. If writers can be disqualified from public forums based on past statements and changing political winds, then participation becomes contingent on institutional nervousness rather than intellectual integrity." End quote. Hear, hear, Peter Greste. That op-ed, which you should go and have a read of, is entitled, quote, "If we silence voices we don't agree with, we're doing the work of extremists for them," end quote. And hear, hear once again. Mark Lawyers managing partner Michael Bradley, who now represents Dr. Abdel Fattah, told the media that the, quote, "moral indefensibility of the Adelaide Festival Board's actions has been amply evidenced by the reaction it has provoked." And I would say that reaction is unprecedented and snowballing. It all happened so rapidly. It was quite remarkable. Michael Bradley also said that the board's decision has also trampled on Dr. Abdel Fattah's human rights, and the board will have to answer for that, end quote. And presumably there will be legal proceedings, notwithstanding we don't have there's no Human Rights Act in South Australia or South Australia. All of the writers and readers in South Australia should get onto that and remedy that deficiency, that democratic deficiency. There's not one in New South Wales. There's not one in Western Australia, although one was recommended in 2006 by a committee of inquiry. There's not one in Tasmania, though one was recommended back in the early 2000s by a committee of inquiry. There is not one in the Northern Territory, but there should be human rights acts implemented everywhere. So at least there can be a educative power informing the government about how it should behave in terms of respecting and protecting the basic human rights of its citizens and constituents. In terms of, there are criticisms to be made of human rights acts, namely that you can't sue for damages for breaches of human rights, which effectively and ironically relegates human rights enshrined by a statute, relegates them to a lower status, I would argue, than common law causes of action where you can sue for damages. It's completely absurd. But again, it was nervous governments placating the Murdoch, hysterical Murdoch press about, quote, lawyers' picnics, etc., which is why they removed that basic protection. But in any event, it is still inherently valuable and inherently part of any healthy democratic system that we need our human rights legally protected. Now, it would be presumed that Dr. Abdel Fattah can still pursue legal action against the board, potentially for, and I'm speculating, defamation and potentially for unlawful racial discrimination. But we will have to wait and see in terms of what the developments are. Now, Jamal Hakim, the Chief Executive of the Australian Arab Institute for Culture and Ideas, the AAICI, stated that the decision is the latest in a worrying trend, and I would agree. He stated, quote, invoking, quote, cultural sensitivity to justify silencing an author does not protect anyone. It sharpens the divide and is deeply troubling. It tells Palestinians that their testimony alone is too dangerous to be heard, that their grief is an unacceptable disturbance in public life. If this community is serious about healing, Palestinian stories and human rights cannot be pushed to the margins. Hear, hear. How much history do we need to be exposed to understand these very basic logical propositions? Sorry, I'm digressing there. I'll get back to the quote. Palestinian stories and human rights cannot be pushed to the margins. They must remain visible, audible, and part of the shared record. Silence does not mend wounds, nor does it help end atrocities, end quote. Again, this is why it is so important as part of any healthy democracy, or any, let's put it more broadly, any system of government that can validly refer to itself as a democracy, to protect the right to peaceful protest. What is happening in the UK in terms of the proscription of a non-violent protesting group is completely absurd. And the fact that a number of members of that group have been on hunger strike, I think one now for 60 days, on the verge of death because they've been held in remand without charge for over, I think coming up, well, it's definitely over a year. And it's completely anomalous, strange, curious, unprecedented, all of those words. And again, it just seems to be the purported democracy of the United Kingdom absolutely smashing any kind of freedom of speech. It is really mind-blowing. So whatever happened to free speech? Well, we might have to do another episode on that. But again, our country, due to various particular, unique developments in the history of this country, we do not have a Bill of Rights. We do not have a Human Rights Act. We do not have an equivalent of the First Amendment. All we've got is defences to defamation. We've got defences to racial vilification or other incitement laws. And those defences are typically for, bona fide artistic endeavours or academic reasons, and fair comment and all of those kinds of defences, but they're not positive protections because they can only be used when you're actually ensconced in litigation and then you're defending yourself. And no one wants to be in that position. Even if you're successful in defending it, you don't want to have, the year or 2 or 3 of your life subsumed by the litigation process. Now, as senior barrister and colleague of mine, Greg Barnes SC, the national spokesman for the Australian Lawyers Alliance, stated to the media, cancelling Dr. Abdel Fattah shows that artists and writers in Australia do not have adequate human rights protections. Greg Barnes SC said, and I quote, "In nations with a Charter of Rights or a Human Rights Act, the right to freedom of expression can be enforced. Governments can be sued for breaching those rights. Although I say in Australia they can't be sued for damages, for compensation. In some of those other countries, I think they can, but certainly not in Australia as yet. Back to Greg's quote. In Canada, for example, its Charter of Rights protects speech, art, and ideas, and actions can be brought against governments that illegitimately interfere with those rights. In other parts of the world, the Adelaide Festival would face legal action for its decision, end quote. But as I said, it seems that the Adelaide Festival Board are still or are currently facing legal action by Dr. Abdel Fattah, notwithstanding we don't have human rights protections in either South Australia or federally. So, of course, one of the outcomes of all of this that has blown up in the past week, but is a worrying downward trend against democracy and freedom of speech, is the broad realisation that Australia urgently needs a federal Human Rights Act. South Australia urgently needs a Human Rights Act. The Northern Territory urgently needs a Human Rights Act. Tasmania, West Australia, New South Wales. The ACT, in fact, was the first state or territory to get a Human Rights Act in 2004, followed by Victoria in 2006, and then a significant gap before we kicked off the campaign in Queensland in 2015, and we finally got it over the line in 2019. Now, it doesn't solve all the problems, but again, on principle, it is necessary for a healthy democracy to legally and lawfully protect human rights, number one. Number two, the existence of human rights legislation performs an educative function to educate the executive arm of government about respecting and protecting and promoting human rights when they go about making day-to-day decisions that affect citizens, constituents, etc. So there is a campaign which you can join for the Federal Human Rights Act at www.humanrightsact.org.au. If you're in New South Wales, there is a campaign that is moving along down there. I'm not sure about Tasmania. Like I said, there was a recommendation to government in the early 2000s, but apparently fell on deaf ears. And in West Australia, in fact, I think it was the former Senator Fred Chaney. He conducted a government commission inquiry in the early 2000s and also recommended a Human Rights Act. A federal Human Rights Act was, of course, also recommended to the Rudd government in 2009, I think, and then Attorney General Robert McClelland, after the Frank Brennan's very broad and wide national inquiry into human rights all around Australia. I think it received more submissions than any other public inquiry, at least at that time. And I think there were 65,000 submissions or something, certainly enough to get the hairs standing up on the backs of necks of politicians down in Canberra, that the public was interested and or concerned about such a topic. And I think it was, I've got a figure, 85.4% of the submissions supported a recommendation of the implementation of a Federal Human Rights Act. And unfortunately, all we got was the very watered down Federal Human Rights Framework, I think it was called. That framework introduced very lackluster developments like statements of compatibility when new bills are brought before Parliament, whether they comply with human rights or not, and if not, why not? And but again, that just becomes a kind of template process, and does anyone really pay attention? One of the valuable things about the human rights framework was the introduction of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. And what I think is brilliant about that is that all of the politicians that sat on that committee, they got a very great and deep education in the history of international human rights law, which of course was born from Australia to some extent and from the mind of a wonderful Anzac, a Gallipoli survivor, Colonel William Roy Hodgson. Colonel Hodgson was injured on his third day at Gallipoli, and he ultimately became an international diplomat, and he was selected as one of 8 people in the whole world to assist Eleanor Roosevelt in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which today, that document, is the most translated text in history, which is, again, quite remarkable. And given that the world appears to be on this complete democratic downslide into disaster, it is worth bearing in mind the remarkable achievements of humanity over the last 80 years. Notwithstanding the UN is kind of completely hopeless and trying to assume the position of the League of Nations at the moment in making itself irrelevant, in the arc of human history, it is utterly remarkable that humanity was able to, at least for a blip in the history of humanity or the universe or whatever it might be, for a blip, an 80-year blip, we were able to not wholly, but to some extent, hold ourselves back from barbarism and the might is right, law of the jungle, and all of those primal instincts, amygdalated instincts of fight, fright, or flight, of being triggered by trauma into traumatizing other people, in ironically attempting to shield oneself from further trauma. But again, it's all caught up in cycles of trauma. Dr. Gabor Mate obviously talks a lot about that. So at least for this 80-year period that we've all been lucky to be born into, at least the ones of us that aren't being subjected to war crimes, atrocities, genocide, etc. But for those of us in Australia who have this privilege, and again, not all Australians, because a lot of Australians do deal with significant disenfranchisement and significant difficulties in life, and in being marginalised, in being from marginalised minorities, in the institutional racism that still exists in our country. It is still all of the aspiration embedded in these texts of international human rights law and international law. There is a huge sign of hope that humanity was able to come to that consensus and maintain it for a number of decades. And hopefully we can continue to see the light and continue to see through the propaganda and the Orwellian and hopefully humanity can continue to see the light and focus on the hopeful aspects of the inherent nature of ourselves as a mammalian species on planet Earth, that we're very good at as Yuval Noah Harari outlined in *Sapiens*, the seminal text, that we're very good at cooperation. And whilst we're also very good in cooperating with new and technologically developed ways to kill each other, we are still also very good at cooperating to build movements for peace and justice and non-violence, etc. So hopefully we can focus on that. Hopefully we get through this current worrisome time where the veil appears to be being lifted off the various types of disingenuous propaganda that seems to have overtaken the good faith historic proclamations and adherence to these transcendent qualities of universal human rights and belief that we can make the world a better place rather than leaving it in bloody ruins. So, alas, I'm digressing again. I just wanted to finish with this. In her op-ed in The Guardian today, resigning from the directorship of Adelaide Writers Week, and of course, as director, Louise Adler had given the invitation to Dr. Abdel Fattah. Now, in this op-ed, Louise Adler both humorously, somberly, and ominously made the following statement. And of course, you should check out the very erudite articulations in the op-ed itself. Adler says, quote, "Many years ago, the former Premier Don Dunstan touted Adelaide as, quote, the Athens of the South, end quote. Now, South Australia's tourism slogan could be, quote, welcome to Moscow on the Torrens, end quote," referring to Malinowskis's Putin points at the 2023 opening that I referred to earlier. Adler says, the board's statement cites community cohesion, an off-reference anxiety which should be treated with scepticism. This is a managerialist term intended to stop thinking. Who, after all, would argue in favour of social division? Presumably only a terrorist or a nihilist. The raison d'etre of art and literature is to disrupt the status quo, and one doesn't have to be a student of history to know that art in the service of social cohesion is propaganda. The arts have allegedly become, quote, unsafe, and artists are a danger to the community's psychosocial well-being. But let's be quite clear. The routine invocation of, quote, safety is code for, quote, I don't want to hear your opinion, end quote. In this instance, it appears to apply to only a Palestinian invitee. The increasingly extreme and repressive efforts of the pro-Israel lobbyists to stifle even the mildest criticism has had a chilling effect on free speech and democratic institutions. The new mantra that Bondi changed everything has offered this lobby, its stenographers in the media, and a spineless political class yet another coercive weapon. Hence, in 2026, the board, in an atmosphere of intense political pressure, has issued an edict that an author is to be cancelled. In the 65-year history of Adelaide Writers Week, there have been no civil disturbances apart from the occasional harumph about the coffee queues or the plaintive query as to why the croissants are full of pumpkin. One might ask any of the concerned individuals whether they have ventured into the Pioneer Women's Memorial Gardens in Adelaide, where more than 160,000 enthusiasts have congregated every year since 2023. Of course, there is no way to protect any of us anywhere from a lone violent extremist, or violent extremists, plural, although stronger gun laws are an obvious starting point. But the reality is that the citizens who come to the Adelaide Writers Week are intensely courteous beyond the rush to claim a seat. listen with the utmost respect to writers, and then head to the book tent to buy stacks of books. But none of this has influenced the decision. A writer is to be cancelled after pressure from pro-Israel lobbyists, bureaucrats, and opportunistic politicians. I cannot be party to silencing writers, so with a heavy heart, I'm resigning from my role as director of the Adelaide Writers Week. Writers and writing matters, even when they are presenting ideas that discomfort and challenge us. We need writers now more than ever as our media closes up, as our politicians grow daily more cowed by real power, as Australia grows more unjust and unequal. Adelaide Writers Week is the canary in the coal mine. Friends and colleagues in the arts, beware of the future. They are coming for you. And that ends the quote of the wonderful, indefatigable Louise Adler, and devastating to hear that she felt forced to resign from that position. But it is important that we are all reasserting our resolve to the fundamental precepts and principles of our democracy in Australia and around the world, but certainly educating ourselves on why the lawful protection of our fundamental, universally recognised, except in Australia, human rights is important, why freedom of speech is important, why freedom of expression, freedom of association, why all of these freedoms, the right to privacy, the right to be free from torture, all of these fundamental consensus concepts of humanity that have crystallized, certainly with the formation of the United Nations over the last 80 years and continue to evolve and develop, and hopefully aren't limping to a early passing. It's important that all of us exercise our agency as concerned citizens in order to educate ourselves, educate others, write more books about it, have more podcasts about it, have more discussions about it, conversations about it, join more campaigns about it, do more something about it, because that way we can all make a very positive and significant difference, as history tells us so loudly and comprehensively. Thank you for your time. If you made it this far, please like and subscribe to the video. I now have a wonderful producer in tow, and we're going to try and get this podcast back up on its feet and doing regular videos and interviews as things go forward. But otherwise, take care, have fun, and enjoy your books. By the way, if you want to get one of these excellent Readers and Writers Against the Genocide t-shirts, you can do so from the Avid Reader Bookshop website and or the @Readers Writers Against Genocide Instagram page, which you should definitely follow and join. So all of it goes towards a good cause or good causes. So check it out, get your t-shirts, and keep supporting independent authors and people supporting freedom of speech. Thank you.